the first half of 2011, Occupy Wall Street is the latest example of a broader shift in the manner by which political dissent is expressed and undertaken. While the signature characteristic of activism in the US has long been protest and march, that tactic, though still useful, has taken a back seat to the strategy of occupation. To better understand these shifts, however, we must look beyond North America. With the Arab uprisings that had began in Tunisia in December of 2010 coming to a head in Cairo's Tahrir Square in February 2011, the role of public space took center stage. In May of that same year, with the Arab world now fully developed in the democratic spirit of Tahrir, the wave of dissent that began months before in North Africa swelled to such heights that it found its way north, across the Mediterranean and into Spain. With a national unemployment of 21% and a rate more than double that for those under the age of 24, Spain was primed for an insurrectionary moment. That moment arrived in the main plazas of Barcelona and Madrid as Movimiento 15M, the 15th of May. The indignados, or the outraged, who comprised the youthful core of 15M, mobilized a week before Spain's national elections, which were to be held on May 22nd. The choice of timing its move into the country's public squares in the lead up to an election was, according to Ernesto Castañeda, the will of the people who, quote, saw no viable alternative between a neoliberalized left and a neoliberal and conservative right, end quote. In Barcelona, the indignados acted upon the chorus of Toma la Plaza, take the square, by planting themselves in the Plaza de Catalunya, a main square located in a wealthy central district. Similar to Occupy's base in the heart of New York's financial district, a mecca of capitalistic success, the uncomfortable but stark locality in which 15M contested the city, quote, reminded Catalans, Spaniards, Europeans, and the world about unemployment, underemployment, poverty, homelessness, and exploitation of migrant labor, end quote, and served as a distinct and effective juxtaposition to daily life, quote, in beautiful, sunny Barcelona. 2 months after the rise of 15M, the countercultural magazine Adbusters sent out the call to Occupy Wall Street over Twitter, later professing the action was to be held, quote, in the spirit of the Spanish indignados, end quote. Once Occupy had mobilized in the fall of 2010, the connections and similarities between the Arab Spring, 15M, and other European movements and OWS became even more apparent. While each movement's grievances and characteristics were certainly unique, there was one commonality within this new and increasingly complex wave of global protest, the contestation of public spaces. Occupy first emerged at Zuccotti Park, a relatively small concrete plot in the middle of New York's financial district. Park, which was soon renamed Liberty Plaza by occupiers, is engulfed by both the sheer scale of the massive buildings that surround it, as well as the symbolic weight of what some of the more famous structures in its immediate vicinity have come to represent. Ground Zero lies just 1 block away. The New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street is right around the corner. One might view each occupation as a small incision into the normative social fabric. Each camp represented a revolutionary space in the otherwise pedestrian day-to-day routine of the city's residents. What we accepted as the mundane obligatory cycle of work, school, home, was suddenly uprooted with a newly politicized rupture in our highly ritualized daily existence. The emergence of physical sites of resistance offered an opening into which we had suddenly been bestowed with the agency to escape our supposed obligations and transform the experience of everyday life into an arena bent on bringing about transcendental change. For roughly 2 months in the fall of 2011, encampments in over 1,000 cities maintained 24-hour presences, serving as the epicenter of the respective OWS offshoots. Aside from the obvious benefits of the increased visibility this tactic garnered for the movement, the encampment's unapologetic insistence on maintaining a continuous physical presence in their respective communities runs much deeper than their superficial or symbolic qualities. In fact, this very structure implies a much-needed intervention about how the working class, the 99%, organizes and acts on its own behalf. George Kafentzis asserts that the occupations speak to a necessary dual function of any class struggle. Firstly, they provide a physical site from which individuals can voice grievances, as any mass movement should do. Moreover, the encampments also function as a, quote, site of reproduction of both labor power and the refusal of labor of the irregularly employed or attracted to the movement, end quote. The second point serves as a possible explanation for why Occupy quote, brought together much of the working class, end quote, something the left has struggled to achieve in recent years, although there's certainly much work to be done in this regard. The latter point is contingent on both an insistence on creating resistant spaces in public, as well as a collective rejection of representative politics. In retrospect, both stood as critical pillars in the foundation of OWS. Therefore, on the occasions when the masses flood into city squares, parks, and plazas to demand change of the status quo, as they did in 2011, it is not so much a demand, but a collective rupture rooted in a loss of confidence in the prevailing hegemonic political order, a consensus no-confidence vote on how a people are supposedly represented by ruling class elites, the 1%. In essence, this process represents a group's perceived need to account for themselves politically because they, quote, no longer trust the apparatus of representation, end quote. Instead, actively deciding to place one's body at the center of political life. With a turn towards a body politics, as Consensus calls it, the personal truly becomes the political. The neoliberal city, in which privatization is evangelized and implemented by governments and the corporate interests that line their pockets, can be seen as the continuation of repressive urban planning, put forth by the likes of Haussmann's Parisian Boulevard scheme and Robert Moses' New York initiatives. Conversely, Occupy's reappropriation of Zuccotti reminds us that spaces are defined and shaped by social processes. Their functions are not fixed, nor are they absolute. This notion of space as relative is grounded by the work of David Harvey, who proposes a tripartite division of space constituted in three categories. Absolute space, quote, when space becomes a thing in itself. Relative space, understood as a relationship between objects which exists only because they exist and relate to each other, end quote. And finally, as relational space, when, quote, space is contained in objects and is said to exist only insofar as it contains and represents itself within relationships to other objects, end quote. While spaces are often shaped and claimed by social and economic forces, such as capitalism, neoliberalism, and other forms of coercion, the model of relative space demonstrates their imbued potentiality, even in this age of market tyranny and inequity. Channeling Henri Lefebvre, Harvey concludes that, quote, when relationality connects to the absolute spaces and time of social and material life, politics comes alive. The reaffirmation of notions of relationality become clear when applied to the specific case of the occupations. The movement successfully sustained an anti-capitalist mass struggle from the bowels of the symbolic capital of capital by diverting and reshaping the social currents that flow through physical spaces. The occasion of OWS is at once an example of how we are capable of reconfiguring and resisting dominant ideologies in everyday life, but also a rare revolutionary moment spawned in response to an unprecedented consolidation of power. The movement's viral rate of proliferation across the US and then globally is best explained by the convergence of a multiplicity of factors rather than one in particular. A brewing crisis of capital had been percolating in virtually every corner of the globe, and mobilized dissidents that served as precursors to Occupy. This, I assert, served to radicalize the constituents of the so-called middle class, establishing new lines of solidarity between historically oppressed and historically privileged groups, creating a more representative 99%. Again, something that is certainly a process and much work is to be done. Furthermore, the horizontal and decentralized organizational platform allowed for the structure that was initially deployed in New York to be replicated throughout the world. Therefore, while the political potential of public space can be established through theory and history, a mass movement's rapid spread of influence and activity requires a myriad of socio-political phenomena to propel it forward. Spaces, in their most basic function, serve only as conduits in the increasingly complex web of circuitry that underscores the social movement. That said, Occupy's insistence on centering its activity through highly spatial and physical means is perhaps the point from which it separates itself from politically similar but less successful or impactful political struggles. I argue these factors, whether they involve the movement's anarchist tendencies, horizontal organizational structures, or the particular nature of its messaging and communicative practices, are imbricated upon a decidedly spatial domain. Defenses eloquently contextualizes these factors. Quote, The truly subversive intent of the Occupy site is to transform public space into a commons. A public space is ultimately a space owned, opened, or closed by the state. It is res publica, a public thing. Common space, in contrast, is opened by those who occupy it, i.e., those who live in it and share it according to their own rules. The Occupy movement is demanding common spaces where they can live, in order to give body to their political thoughts. This is what the government and Wall Street especially hate about the occupations. They prefigure another way to organize society and to create a new commons. The parliaments and council chambers are temples of absence, while the Tahrir squares of the world are places where a general will is embodied and in action. End quote. This critical distinction of public versus common spaces reveals a dual function viewed in the emergent physicality of resistance. The creation of common spaces is at once a means to address the imminent threat of dispossession faced by many communities who have been ripped of any agency or control over their land. It also serves as a mechanism to expose broader trends of privatization, wealth consolidation, and the anti-democratic mechanisms that allow formerly public spaces to enter the grasp of the few at the expense of the many. 2 years removed from the initial spark of the mass uprisings in the Arab world, in Spain and other European nations, and Occupy in the US, the officious will of the global economic and political cartel remains powerful and determined to quash their detractors. In Egypt, for example, revolutionaries who found success in toppling a decades-old regime through an uncorrupted democratic will have since witnessed the ascent of other establishment political enterprises that filled the subsequent power vacuum. First with military rule, and then with a conservative majority that has, broadly speaking, simply replaced an old flavor of repression with a new one. In Europe, wildly unpopular, headed by the FBI, but also involving an astounding consortium of federal agencies working alongside local authorities. What does this extreme show of state force mean for Occupy? What hidden meaning might be codified into a state apparatus that has been proven to act at the beck and call of private interests? It tells us they're afraid. They're afraid of losing grip on the consenting citizenry from whom the basic mechanisms of liberal democratic hegemony and control function. They are afraid of democracy. Anthropologist and activist David Graeber elaborates, stating, quote, "As the history of past movements makes clear, nothing rifles those running the United States more than the danger of democracy breaking out. The immediate response to even a spark of democratically organized civil disobedience is a panicked combination of concessions and brutality. How else can one explain the national mobilization in the fall of 2011 of thousands of riot cops, the beatings, chemical attacks, and mass arrests of citizens engaged in precisely the kind of democratic assemblies the Bill of Rights was designed to protect, and whose only crime, if any, was the violation of local camping regulations." End quote. It is at once gratifying and frightening to digest this sentiment. Gratifying in knowing we'll likely end up on the right side of history, in realizing how a relatively small series of events and people scare the most powerful entity in human history, the United States government, to try to stamp out this resistance with such heavy force. Frightening because many of us study history not to remember bygones, but to foresee future events through our own interpretations of the past. Because history reminds us that those who end up on its right side often face martyrdom, imprisonment, or persecution during their lives, only to be vindicated in death or old age. More likely, though, it is a combination, or perhaps a summation of many intersecting emotions. An ease in grasping an understanding of a political, ethical set of values that supersedes any law or constitution because it strives to only draw cues and inspiration from learned, lived, and concrete applications, rather than self-interest or ideology. Apprehensive because we can never quite tell which side is winning, or what winning even means. Or overwhelmed, even if optimistically, by the thick haze of unknown that ceaselessly rises from beneath the paving stones on the path towards utopia. Thank you.